Cheers, guys. Epix911. Welcome to the Elitist Geek. Tonight's episode, I want to talk about roguelikes. Roguelikes today are varied. I mean, the definition of what a roguelike is has been stretched, twisted, pulled, and basically abused in almost every possible way. Because one roguelike really doesn't resemble the other. Basically, anything that has random elements in it can almost be called a roguelike. But there is a tighter definition. And if we travel back in time to the original game, Rogue, which is how roguelikes got their name, we'll begin to understand the patterns and why roguelikes are so varied today. Where did it start? Well, it started on the university campuses. The biggest game in the 1970s, if you were a fantasy buff and you liked J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, was without a doubt Dungeons and Dragons. It was played all over North America, college campuses from California to Quebec, down to Florida, and back up to the Pacific Northwest. Basically, every region of the continent, every campus had some group of people who played Dungeons and Dragons. The problem with Dungeons and Dragons is it was a very social game. You couldn't play it by yourself, which is fine. Usually wasn't difficult because of its popularity to find a group. But if you were ever alone, short of some really kind of sad solo attempts, it really wasn't practical, because a lot of what made Dungeons and Dragons fun was the social element. Well, a group of 3 programmers, Michael Toy, Ken Arland, and Glenn Wickman, if I'm pronouncing their names correctly and not butchering them, decided to see if they could create a game that they themselves could enjoy playing. Because the problem is if you're a game programmer and you create a game, you're going to know where everything is. There's going to be absolutely no fucking challenge when you know every monster, you know what's behind every door and every room, and you know where all the magic items are stored and stashed. So they wanted to create a game, they called it Rogue, which is where the genre got its name from, that could surprise even them. And the result of that labor of love, Rogue, was finished in 1980. And let me tell you, it was the absolute fucking bane of lab administrators on every campus, because it became so popular that it basically tied up mainframes, which it was programmed on, to the point where a lot of the mainframe admins had to ban the application. They deleted it upon sight, and yet it survived. Kind of like a virus does today, it became so popular and was spread so far that within a few short years, everybody at the university level knew what Rogue was, even if we, at home with the microcomputer, still hadn't been introduced to it. But we would. In fact, an official version of Rogue was released by a company called Epix, which is where I get my handle moniker from, in 1985. The computer that I loved, the Commodore 64, got a version, I think, by mid-1985. But before that, a lot of games had been released on almost every 8-bit platform that took elements of the original Rogue. Some were inspired by Rogue. Some were basically created independently, based on some of the same ideas and concepts. But all, it could be argued today, would be considered roguelikes by definition. Games such as Telengard, which was released in 1982 on the Commodore 64 and happened to be my first exposure to a roguelike. It was brutal, it was tough, it was extremely random, and it had dozens of levels from what I can remember. Another game that I enjoyed just as much, Sword of Fargol, I believe was released in 83 or 84, and featured, a hero who had to traverse a dungeon to fetch the Sword of Fargol and bring it back to the surface, which would become the plot of quite a few roguelikes. There was another game I enjoyed, Gateway to Apshai, which was a bit looser. It wasn't turn-based, it was real-time, but featured a lot of the same elements: random items, random dungeons, and a character who would go up levels and had to get to the bottom of a dungeon and or back up. Moraf's Revenge, which was a 3D like, you know, the first attempt at a 3D one. That was a little bit later. But the point is that lots of people took the original concept of Rogue because they loved the game so much and wanted to expand on it. And that is what made Rogue not just so legendary, but spawned the genre of roguelikes. Because the game was so awesome, everybody who played it wanted more. And not just in terms of you know, levels or items, but everything. They wanted a deeper rule set. They wanted a deeper itemization table, more monsters. So what you saw was teams springing up across North America. And each of these teams, you know, kind of made their own version slightly different. Well, 4 of these became super popular. And they're considered the big 4. And it's almost like when we talk about heavy metal and you talk about thrash metal, which is a genre that I enjoy a lot, we say, when we talk about thrash metal, we talk about the big 4. And we talk about Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, and Metallica as being the big 4 thrash bands. Well, roguelikes also had their big 4. And those big 4 were NetHack, Angband, Adam, which stood for Ancient Domains of Mystery, and a title called Dungeon Crawl, which is now known as Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup. These 4 have continued pretty much to today, being developed, and they all kind of went a different direction. Angband, I think, kind of went the J.R.R. Tolkien route, but has its own literally hundreds of variants. Dungeon Crawl probably stayed the most pure to the original Rogue. NetHack was the sadistic, you know, sadistic little brother or older brother to Rogue. It was extremely tough and extremely random in how you died. So you couldn't really count on memorizing the things that killed you game to game because they themselves would change. And it's a very tough game, and there's people who spend literally their entire life, excuse me, and never beat the game because it's that sadistically tough. My favorite of the 4 would probably be Adam, Ancient Domains of Mystery. I played that game in the 1990s when I worked at Electronic Arts, and it was absolutely fantastic. It was a German programmer, Thomas Biskup, who created the game, and it features an overland, so you're not just in a dungeon, but you've got some world traversing that you're doing as well. And he's even managed to do an Indiegogo campaign, I don't believe it was Kickstarter, and create a graphical version of that today, which is something I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye out for because I love the original. Now, so we've talked about kind of how Rogue came about and why it came about. It was, you know, to try to recreate the D&D experience for a single player and present to the author gameplay that they themselves couldn't predict. You know, that would be random enough for the game programmer to enjoy it. But what are the elements that bring roguelikes together? Well, they're basically random. For the longest time, they were ASCII characters, even though Telengard and Sword of Fargold didn't feature ASCII characters. I'm talking about the big 4. The traditional, actual rogue games, the roguelike games, the big 4, were ASCII-based. And what ASCII-based was basically the mainframes at the time, they couldn't produce graphics. Or if they could, they were super primitive and it was super involved. But what they could do was allow you to manipulate the character set that existed for type. So they would take those characters and the, you know, ampersand became the hero and letters became the monster. So you know, your small d would be a dragon, etc., etc. And it was fantastic lines for the dungeon walls themselves because it allowed your imagination to take over, kind of like reading a book. It was fantastic in that way. Now, these games have evolved over time, and there's games right now that are obvious when I mention them that they're based on a roguelike. Like if I say Diablo to anybody, most people are going to acknowledge that, oh yeah, okay, well that's got all the elements that you mentioned, except it's not turn-based and it's got graphics. True. But Diablo itself, from the programmer's own tell of the story, was based on NetHack, which was one of the big four that I mentioned. The only thing they did different is they made it real-time, and they made it graphical, so it was no longer ASCII characters. But what it did is it brought the game to the mainstream. A lot more people played Diablo than probably played the original roguelike in the day, even though it was that popular. We also see games like Shiren the Wanderer for the Nintendo DS. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, which is another game based on Rogue. Now those two stayed turn-based, okay? And the PC got its own versions too. In fact, there was a game released just a couple of years ago called Dungeons of Dredmor, which is fantastic. It is about as traditional as you can get, with the one exception being that instead of ASCII characters, you've got graphics. But don't let that dissuade you, because Dungeons of Dredmor is fantastic. In every other sense of the definition, it's a roguelike. And it pays absolute homage to the roguelikes of old. In fact, when I make my recommendations at the end, it's going to figure into those recommendations. So, we talk about all these elements. Well, in I believe it was 2008, in Berlin, in fact, they call it the Berlin interpretation, a group of programmers try to nail down a standard definition for roguelike, or at least a starting point. And most of the things I talked about, are part of that definition. But as you know, with games like Spelunky and The Binding of Isaac and FTL Faster Than Light, all of them are considered roguelike-likes, but they almost have nothing to do with the original Rogue. Yep. But they do have those elements. Randomization, right? Which is called procedural generation in programming lingo. So no two games are ever the same, because of those random elements, which is awesome. So finally, what would I recommend? So if you were looking to play a roguelike today, and you asked me, of course there's the old school roguelikes, but I would also urge you to try some of the modern games out. So I talked about Dungeons of Dredmor. Absolutely, that one would be critical, would be the first one that I would go to. Another one that actually sprung from Angband is Tales of Maj'eyal, which is like Dungeons of Dredmor. It's itself, it's based on Angband. It's graphical. It's still turn-based, just like Dungeons of Dredmor, except where Dungeons of Dredmor really takes the gameplay into the domain of humor. Tales of Maj'eyal takes itself a bit more serious, and it's got overland travel and dungeons and all the elements of a roguelike, but in a modern shell. I would say it would look like an early 90s, late 80s game in terms of the level of graphics. Almost like one of Spiderweb Software's, Jeff Vogel, if you're familiar with his games, it would kind of come across as about that level. So I would say early to mid 90s graphics, but fantastic. And then I would actually play Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, would be the third. Of the big four, it's probably the easiest to get into. It's pretty straightforward, hell of a lot of fun. Interested in hearing what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if these are the type of videos you like to see. Like if you like this video, and don't like if you don't. And if you don't, let me know in the comments why below. Love to get discussion going. Also, if there's some roguelikes that you enjoy that I haven't talked about, let me know in the comments below. I'm always looking for a new roguelike, always curious. And if you've got any more questions on what I may have missed on roguelikes, you know, that was the 101 history in a nutshell, let me know in the comments and I can do a follow-up video. As always, guys, till next time, cheers.